Welcome to this series on Christian faith and American culture. Questions have been raised about the relationship between Christianity and America. I hope to address such questions in these sessions. Now, whenever we talk about the influence of faith on the culture of a nation, there are two different perspectives for Christians that must be brought into balance. First, there is the admonition from Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount, where he says that his followers are to be salt and light in the world. That means that Christians are not to withdraw from the culture, but rather are to bring the faith into the culture to help provide the truth necessary for a healthy culture. But then there's the other perspective, just as valid, that indicates that Christians are not really at home in this world and shouldn't partake of the evils in a culture. I mean, the Apostle Peter called Christians strangers and pilgrims, as translated in the King James Version of the Bible. A newer translation uses the words foreigners and exiles. Now, regardless of which words are used, the meaning is clear. Followers of Christ should never consider this world as their ultimate home. The next world is eternal. So, Christians are to be an influence in the culture, yet not be totally at home in it. So how does one find the balance? That's one of the primary questions that this series is going to seek to answer. But first, let me establish my credentials. I mean, after all, why should you listen to me on this subject? What substance do I have to offer? Many people have opinions about America and Christianity, but they're not always informed opinions, so why will mine be different? I have earned a doctorate in American history, but I realize that others have that credential who may not interpret history in the same way that I do. So merely having that doctorate isn't sufficient as a basis for trusting my interpretation. Yet there are some advantages for those who have stayed the course and completed a history doctorate. First, they have some knowledge of historiography, which means knowledge of the history of history writing. Second, those who complete a history doctorate will have been trained in research skills, learning to discern the difference between reliable sources and perhaps those that might be questionable. And closely related to that is the discipline of documenting every main idea and quotation relevant to the topic at hand. A trained historian won't give credence to phony quotes, for instance. I've had all that training. It doesn't make me omniscient. I never will, declare that. Neither does it mean I won't make mistakes in interpretation, but it does mean I'm aware of the problems in historical research and writing, and that I do seek to try to avoid them. Now, sadly, many who attempt to interpret history have no solid background in the discipline, and simply look for whatever backs up their preconceived ideas about history. When that happens with Christians, it's doubly troubling. And that leads me to my next qualification. I am a Christian. Now, some may say that's a negative because I won't be objective, but I'll come back to that concern shortly. I like the image that Christian writer C.S. Lewis uses that I think will help bring some clarity to the issue of whether a Christian can speak legitimately about the proper relationship between faith and culture. In one of his essays with the interesting title of Meditation in a Tool Shed, Lewis asks readers to imaginatively place themselves inside a tool shed. There's a crack at the top of the door where light shines in. Lewis says that when you stand aside from the light, you can see what it consists of, specks of dust and so forth, because you're looking at the light. But if you move into the light and look toward the door, you now see the sky, trees, anything else outside the tool shed. You're now looking along the light. Looking along allows you to see more than just the light itself. You now can see other things that you couldn't see if you're simply looking at the light from the side. There are many applications that can be made from this insight, but relevant to our discussion is this. Someone might be able to look at Christianity and describe it, but without any personal experience with that faith, you might not really grasp its essentials, the things you may see as you look along the faith. So while Lewis says both are valid ways of understanding, he nevertheless stresses the significance of looking along because it provides greater insight of the subject being addressed. A famous Lewis quote that fits well here is, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." That expresses what I believe about my ability to address this subject, as one who looks along the beam, seeing everything through it, which I think is important for this topic. So let me just say that being a Christian means I have a good grasp of what Christianity is all about, and that's essential if one is going to comment on the relationship between that faith and American culture. I can also say that my Christianity hasn't been confined to only one group of Christians. I've worshiped and been a member of many different denominations over the decades, and am familiar with nearly all of the main ones. I've experienced both the strengths and weaknesses of nearly every branch of Christendom. Further, I've delved into church history in depth, have taught courses on each age of Christian faith. I show no favoritism for any specific branch of Christian faith, but my presuppositions are first and foremost biblical in orientation. What does that mean? It's the grid through which I see the world, and it's grounded upon biblical principles. These principles form the basis for my values, my decisions, my analysis of right and wrong. My academic background and my faith, therefore, work together in harmony. The training that I received in academia requires that I follow the evidence wherever it may lead. I must be honest. I cannot, in good conscience, misrepresent the facts. Properly understood, there's no dichotomy here. My Christianity and my academic training require the same standard, which is academic integrity, which rests upon moral integrity, which I believe flows from Christian faith. So I enter upon this series committed to truth and a desire to follow the evidence, with the hope that I can make a contribution to understanding the relationship between Christianity and American culture. Let's now turn to 3 words that we need to comprehend before trying to interpret history. These words are objective, subjective, and biased. They do require some definition. When we talk about being objective, we need to be careful. It sounds like it should be the ultimate goal, where nothing influences our views of the evidence, as if we stand outside of the history and can see it all clearly. That's a nice goal. But why then do people come up with different interpretations of the same historical evidence? It's my considered opinion that none of us is objective in the complete sense of that word. Each person's personal background, family life, education, culture, many other factors, plays a role in how we see evidence. It can color how we interpret that evidence. That's called subjectivity. We each have personal baggage, if I might use that word, that we carry with us and that influences our perceptions. That cannot be avoided. But it doesn't have to be a major problem. We're not determined by our personal baggage or our environment. We have free will. Therefore, we can choose to recognize the baggage and make allowance for it. We'll always have some subjectivity, but we can still be fair with the evidence if we're alert to that subjectivity. Everyone is subjective, but we can be what I call subjectively objective. What we do want to avoid at all costs is being biased, which basically means we come at a subject with preconceived ideas and no amount of evidence will change our views. Bias is simply dishonest, and the fruit of bias is dishonest history. In fact, it can't really be called history at all because there's no real commitment to truth. The result of all this thinking about objectivity, subjectivity, and bias leads us not to perfection in historical understanding, but at least to honesty, as we deal with the evidence fairly, despite our own personal baggage. So honesty, integrity, that is my pledge to you as we journey through this series. We now need to understand what we mean when we use the word history. History is not just a listing of dates and events. That's simply a chronicle, which is little different from a timeline. Far too much history is taught in this way, which has led to students thinking it's a rather dry subject. But real history is anything but dry. Yes, it does give us facts and events, and usually in the order in which they occurred, but it's also a narration, which means it's the telling of a story. And what do stories have? Well, complete with plot, setting, characters. Stories grab our attention. Good history is history that tells a good story. By that I don't mean fiction. The actual facts of history can be as good a story as any piece of fiction. What differentiates history from a chronicle is that history deals with causes and effects. And that's where the different interpretations come in. While there are nuances when it comes to examining the various interpretations of history, I can give 2 examples for how American history can be seen from opposite poles. For instance, for some historians, slavery plays such a significant role in American history that it is seen as central to all of the history. Since many founders held slaves, they are portrayed as primarily hypocrites. Since the Constitution didn't outlaw slavery, they look upon it as abominable, and the history of slavery that follows into the antebellum era, in their view, confirms that interpretation. Then there's the polar opposite viewpoint that looks back on the founding and sees very little to critique. The founding was Christian and, in this view, nearly a golden age. Carrying that further, some of the more enthusiastic adherents to this view consider the Constitution to be almost a divine document inspired by God. Now, allow me to interject here my response to those two very different interpretations. First, I don't believe that all of American history should be seen through the lens of slavery. In a future session, I'll make it clear that the existence of slavery in America was evil and deserved to be condemned and removed. But claiming that slavery was the primary reason for everything gives it more credit than it is due. And what might be referred to as the Golden Age interpretation suffers from a willful blindness about the problems that did exist at the founding. Neither does it take into account the beliefs of those who were not Christians. So where do I stand on America's founding as we begin this series? Well, let me explain. First, it is correct that the general society at that time had significant biblical roots. A biblical worldview is evident in public documents and legislation, and even those who weren't Christians looked at the world through a Christian framework of thinking. The general consensus, which means general agreement, in that era was that God existed, that there was an afterlife, and that how we conducted ourselves in this life would determine where we spend eternity. Christians and non-Christians alike held to that general viewpoint. Most of the non-Christians paid lip service to Christian faith, but they weren't believers in the divinity of Christ. Therefore, because of this consensus and the fact that laws were based on it, one can say, in a limited way, that America began as a Christian nation, but we can't go as far as those who hold to the Golden Age perspective. So what will this mean going forward? I will not hesitate in pointing out the Christian influence of the age and the Christians who made a major contribution to the nation. I mean, that really can't be ignored. Yet I also will be brutally honest, as necessary, whenever American culture violated biblical norms. Integrity calls for this. And more than anything else, I seek to demonstrate that integrity. A culture can be nominally Christian while showcasing, sadly, the lack of internal devotion to genuine Christian faith. We call this a civil religion, a topic I'll come back to repeatedly throughout the series. So let me now give you an overview of what this series will cover. First, we'll look at the settlers who came to America for religious purposes. Separatists in England were escaping the official Church of England, also called the Anglican Church, because they were persecuted for wanting to set up their own churches. We now know them as the Pilgrims. Puritans in England didn't seek to separate, but they did want to remake the Church of England into their own image. They were persecuted also, so they sought to set up in the New World a model of Christian society. The issue of uniting the church with the state has been controversial throughout all of church history, and problems with that arrangement is what led to setting up these early colonies. A Great Awakening in the mid-18th century revitalized colonial Christianity, yet it also divided churches, as debate centered on the actions of some of those revivalists. As we progress into the era of the American Revolution, we see a merger between Christian faith and a certain type of Enlightenment ideology, so we'll see what they had in common. We'll look at the Christian influence on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, try to see how that worked with the Enlightenment philosophy. In the process of forming the new nation, questions were raised about the relationship between church and state. A trend toward disestablishment began. The first half of the 19th century is called the antebellum era, so named because it precedes the Civil War. Another Great Awakening arose during this time, leading to a nation identified even more with Protestantism. However, even as the Christian faith became more dominant than before, the issue of slavery tore Christians apart. There also were non-Christian beliefs that started to emerge during this time. Along with the debate over slavery, the treatment of Native Americans came to the forefront with the infamous Trail of Tears. How did Christians deal with that issue? We'll examine that. The Civil War itself was a challenge to the faith. And what about Abraham Lincoln? What role did he play in attempting to comprehend the will of God during this crisis? A number of new challenges to Christian faith developed after the Civil War. Darwinism, Freudianism, changes in education that led a movement away from a Christian worldview. So how did the churches respond to this new movement? Some chose syncretism, merging with the new thinking, while others, called fundamentalists, held steady to the traditional faith. Later, a split occurred within fundamentalism, with the rise of what we now call evangelicalism. How did it differ from fundamentalism? We will see. Post-World War II America did experience a renewal of respect for Christian faith, especially with the ministry of Billy Graham at the forefront of this new evangelicalism. Yet a key question to be asked is, how deep was this Christian renewal? Was it primarily a civil religion focused on externals, or did it involve a true heart change and a genuine Christian commitment? The 1960s witnessed cultural shifts that left many Christians feeling as if the nation was losing its morality, especially with the rejection of Bible reading and prayer in schools. But that educational issue once more brought up the problem of linking the church with the state. What is permissible and what is not in a society that values religious liberty? Abortion, beliefs about human sexuality further alienated conservative Christians who turned to politics in an attempt to restore biblical values. So what are the limits to that fusion of faith and politics? That's at the heart of the primary question for this series. How are Christians supposed to respond to a society that is not what they want it to be? What is God calling us to be in this new era? The answer has to be more than a reaction to what we don't like. The answer has to lie with the nature of the faith given to us by Christ. How are we to live it out in the right spirit? By the time this series ends, I hope we can at least picture some kind of spiritual roadmap for Christians as we navigate within a culture that in many ways is foreign to our faith. Session 2 begins that journey. I invite you to join with me as we examine American history and its relationship with the Christian faith.